The first dry crack split through the earth like a warning. It came in early May, just after the last frost had faded and before the promise of summer had arrived. The sun hovered low that morning, casting golden streaks over the valley floor, where Clara Beaumont stood barefoot in the fields, staring at the dry, brittle stalks of wheat that hadn't grown an inch since she planted them. Her knuckles were scraped raw from weeks of work, her boots were too worn to wear, and the skin under her eyes had turned shadowy from worrying. What once was a thriving homestead had grown quiet, stubborn, and hungry. The soil had turned to ash beneath her, and no one, not even the sky, was listening. 2 years ago, Clara had inherited the land from her father, a proud man who carved every fence post by hand and died whispering that the land would take care of her if she took care of it. But now the wind howled differently. The animals had stopped bearing young. The water from the well tasted like rust, and when Clara wrote letters to the local co-op for help, no one responded. Not even a loan, not even pity. The town whispered about her. They said she was cursed, that no woman alone could manage a spread that big, that she should sell and move to the city where the buildings didn't rely on rainfall. But Clara had buried her father under the cottonwood tree, and every time she passed that patch of shade, she promised his memory she wouldn't quit. She wouldn't run, even if the land itself had turned its back on her. By mid-June, the sky burned hot and white. Every morning she woke to silence, no birds, no bees. The once vibrant green hills looked sun-scoured and exhausted. She tried everything, changed fertilizer, dug new irrigation ditches by hand, planted twice, nothing took root. She even burned sage and prayed aloud in the wind, though she didn't know if she believed in any god that would hear her. But even the wind stayed still, like the valley was holding its breath, waiting for her to break. Then came the letter, folded twice and tucked beneath a smooth, dark stone on her porch. There was no name, no stamp, just a message. I have what your land needs. I am coming. Don't leave. She stared at the words for a long time, wondering if it was a prank. The handwriting was precise but old-fashioned, like it belonged to a time before railroads. For 3 days she waited, watching the trail, hearing only the sound of her own heartbeat in the silence of her empty fields. When he arrived, he did so without dust or announcement. A black horse, slick as oil and twice as quiet, trotted over the hill at dusk. The man on its back wore a wide-brimmed hat, a long woven coat patterned with traditional Navajo symbols, and silver rings that shimmered like polished moonlight. His face was carved with time, but his back was straight and his eyes clear. Clara didn't know who he was, but the horse walked straight to the barn like it had been here before. Like it remembered a version of this place she didn't. He said nothing, just handed her a small leather pouch tied with red thread. Inside were seeds round, golden, and warm, like they had been kissed by fire. On the bottom of the pouch was a single carved stone marked with a symbol Clara didn't recognize. She wanted to ask who he was, why he had come, but before she could form a thought, he pointed at the field, nodded once, and disappeared into the twilight. Not riding away, just gone. That night, she stood alone in the dust with those strange seeds in her palm, feeling their heat pulse like they were alive. She had nothing left to lose. And somehow, she knew the land was about to speak again, but what it would say was not what anyone expected. The earth remembers, but can it forgive? Clara's redemption or her ruin is buried just beneath the surface. Keep watching to discover the truth behind the mysterious seeds. And the Navajo millionaire who carried more than just a cure for dying crops. Like and subscribe for the next chapter of Echoes of Frontier Redemption. This story is only just beginning. The morning after the stranger vanished, Clara stood by the edge of her parched field, staring at the pouch in her hand as if it held answers she wasn't sure she wanted. The golden seeds inside it glowed faintly when the sunlight hit them. As though fire still lived in their veins, she thought about the man, his silence, his stare, the way his presence seemed to shift the weight of the valley. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew deep in her tired bones that he had not lied. With her fingers trembling, Clara walked past the rows of shriveled cornstalks, past the broken fence post she still hadn't mended, and stood before the cottonwood tree where her father was buried. The grass here still grew thin and defiant, and the soil held more moisture than the rest of the land. She knelt beside the faded cross, cleared the old leaves and weeds, and began to dig a shallow trench in the soil. Her father had always believed the land spoke to those who listened. She wasn't sure if she believed in voices anymore, but the silence had grown too heavy not to act. She placed the seeds there, every last one, and covered them with careful hands. No fertilizer, no irrigation, just the dirt, the sun, and the memory of a man who once said, "Let the earth remember who it belongs to." Then she waited. She didn't water them, didn't pray, didn't even hope. She just watched. One day passed, then another. On the third day, the wind returned. It started with a low sigh through the trees and a stirring of dust along the fence line. Then the clouds began to gather. They weren't the usual heavy, gray bruises that promised storms but never delivered. These were soft, white-bellied clouds glowing with a golden shimmer, rolling slow across the sky like something sacred. And just before dusk, as Clara stood barefoot in the middle of her dying field, the rain came. Not a storm, not a flood. Just rain, pure and warm, falling straight down in perfect rhythm, soaking her skin and seeping into the ground. The soil drank it in like a starving child. And under the cottonwood, where the seeds had been buried, the first green shoot pushed through the surface before night fell. By morning, there were dozens, but they weren't wheat. Not corn, not beans. They were something else, something she'd never seen. The stems were thick and red-veined, the leaves wide, dark, and glossy like leather. And when she reached to touch one, it gave off a faint scent of sage and citrus and something older, something like firewood in the mountains or the inside of a cedar chest. She sat beside them until the sun rose high, unable to move. She wasn't alone anymore. Something was changing, and for the first time in months, the valley breathed. But with that breath came questions, because when she walked back to the house, soaked and shaking, she found a bundle left on her porch, wrapped in leather, her name carved into the flap. Inside it, a photograph. It was her father, young, smiling, standing beside the man who had come on the horse. But the photo was dated 1973, long before Clara was born, and the man beside her father looked exactly the same. No older. Not one wrinkle different. As if time hadn't dared touch him. Clara dropped the bundle. Her breath caught in her chest. What had her father known? Who was that man? And what kind of seeds had she just planted? She didn't sleep that night. Because as she looked out at the glowing green sprouts beneath the cottonwood, they seemed to be moving ever so slightly, as though they weren't growing, but waking. The days that followed were both a miracle and a riddle. The strange plants beneath the cottonwood didn't just grow, they flourished. Within a week, they were waist-high, thick with glossy black pods that pulsed under sunlight like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Bees returned, so did birds. The air shifted, cooler, gentler. The dying grass around the house turned green again, and Clara's chickens, silent for months, began laying eggs daily. The well water cleared, the barn swelled with warmth again, and her old mule, Toothpick, stopped limping. The land was healing, but Clara was unraveling. She couldn't explain what was happening. The plants looked like no species she'd ever read about, and she'd studied plenty in her quiet hours. They seemed half wild, half tamed, like something between the earth and something older. And each night, when she tried to sleep, she dreamt of mountains, red rock canyons, feathers on fire, a child's laughter echoing in the wind. But it wasn't the crops or the dreams that haunted her most. It was the photo. She kept returning to it. Her father, 20, maybe 25, stood grinning, arm around the mysterious Navajo man who had delivered the seeds. The date on the back read July 5, 1973, but the man hadn't changed. Not in 50 years, not a single line. Clara had examined it in every light, every angle, every magnification. No trick, no editing. Just impossible truth. And then came another letter. This one was pinned to her barn door with a carved obsidian arrowhead. It said, "The land remembers. Now you must. No name, no return trail." Just that message, that afternoon, Clara climbed into the attic of the old farmhouse where dust-coated memory and every floorboard grown like a secret. She opened her father's old trunk, untouched since the funeral. Inside were ledgers, tools, and wrapped bundles of letters dated from the 1960s. She opened one marked in faded pencil. To M, from WB. It wasn't addressed to her father. It was from him. The mysterious man. The handwriting matched. She read, "By the slanting light from a broken attic window." The letter spoke of a promise made between a soldier and a stranger, of land cursed by betrayal and blessed by blood, of seeds that could heal only when planted by those pure in purpose, not profit, and of a child who would inherit the valley and a burden older than the borders that split nations. The signature at the bottom was in a language she didn't understand, but the postscript chilled her bones. "When the pods open, do not run. They are listening." That night, Clara stood in the field, lantern in hand. The pods on the strange plants had swelled like ripe fruit. She watched, breath shallow, as one of them split open, not with a crack, but a sigh. Inside was a thick, glowing substance the color of melted gold. It dripped into the earth, and the soil where it touched shimmered. She knelt, touched it with her finger. It didn't burn, it didn't smell, but it pulsed with warmth and memory. And then she heard footsteps. Behind her. From the direction of the woods. She turned. It was him, the man. The stranger, the ghost, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him walked two older women in long turquoise shawls, a boy with a flute carved from bone, and a woman with braided hair that reached her waist carrying a basket of unmarked stones. None of them spoke. But they didn't have to. The land was speaking now, and Clara had no choice but to listen. They gathered just before midnight in the open field under the cottonwood where the glowing pods now gleamed like lanterns in the dirt. The stranger stood at the center. The others formed a quiet ring around him, those with faces carved by wisdom and weather, who seemed older than the hills and still more rooted. Clara stood just beyond the ring, barefoot and holding the pouch the seeds had come in, now empty but still warm to the touch. The land was not quiet anymore. The wind circled low. The pods swayed without breeze. The earth murmured under her toes, like it was exhaling centuries. The man raised a hand and motioned toward the tree. One of the older women placed the basket of stones on the ground. Clara recognized the symbol carved into each, matching the one burned into her seed pouch, the same as the one etched onto her father's old journal cover she'd found that morning. A symbol shaped like a circle with 3 descending waves, a mark of water, memory, and root. Then the stranger stepped forward and placed the stones, one by one, into the soil around the cottonwood. Each one clicked into place like part of an ancient machine. A circle began to form, 12 stones. Then 13. Clara stepped forward, heart pounding, as the last stone was placed, and when it touched the soil, the entire valley changed. The trees shivered. The clouds trembled. The grass bowed like a sea of green silk. The pods burst open all at once without noise, without violence. The golden liquid pooled across the furrows of dead crops, and then it began to rise. Not like water, but like memory taking shape. Visions surrounded Clara, not ghosts, not dreams. Histories. She saw settlers in wagons trampling sacred ground. She saw her great-grandfather signing a deed he'd never read. She saw her father, younger, kneeling at this very tree, accepting a seed from the stranger's hand and weeping. She saw blood spilled into the soil, broken treaties, forgotten names. She saw the land itself crying for memory. The man finally spoke, not aloud, but into her heart. This valley was once sacred. Then it was stolen. The crops failed because the land forgot itself. You brought it back. Clara fell to her knees. Her father had known. The seeds weren't just plants, they were witnesses. Living keepers of balance, the circle was never about profit. It was about penance. The woman with the long braid stepped forward and touched Clara's forehead. And in that instant, she saw her mother, not the stern woman she remembered, but a laughing girl beside a Red Canyon river, holding hands with the man who now stood before her. Clara gasped. The truth crashed over her like a flood. This man wasn't just a stranger. He was family. Her grandfather, half of her blood, belonged to this valley in ways no title deed could prove. He turned to her now, fully visible under moonlight, and removed the silver ring from his finger. He placed it in Clara's palm. The land is yours now. But so is the burden. And then he turned, and the others followed him toward the canyon trail. They vanished into the shadows. The next morning, Clara woke under the cottonwood, the silver ring clenched in her fist, the plants glistening in the early sun. But something had changed. All across her land, the soil was dark and rich again. And in every furrow, new crops had begun to grow: corn, wheat, beans, all alongside the glowing mystery plants that the land had forgiven, but only because it had been remembered. And Clara would never forget. The valley was alive again, but not loud, not boastful. It thrummed like a heart healing after years of silence. The air had changed. Rain came when it was needed. The trees seemed greener. Coyotes no longer cried at night. Even the wind carried something sweet through the leaves, like the land was humming its own lullaby. But for Clara Beaumont, the awakening of the land only deepened the mystery of her family's past and the price that came with it. She didn't sleep for days. Not from fear, but from revelation. She read every one of her father's hidden letters, his journals, and even the brittle, faded contract she found in the floorboards of the barn, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in wax. It was dated April 1871. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, written in ink that had not faded with time. It outlined a land grant deal between Clara's great-grandfather and a government agent. But this wasn't a regular transaction. It was an agreement forged with deception. The document transferred 300 acres of sacred Navajo land into the hands of the Beaumonts in exchange for 5 barrels of flour and 3 mules. A signature in broken English, likely coerced, sat beneath the deal from a Navajo elder, Mikal, son of the Whispering River. Clara recognized the name. She had seen it carved on the stone circle under the cottonwood. She had seen it in the dream. Her land was built on betrayal. Everything her family had planted had grown from stolen roots. The stranger, her grandfather, hadn't come just to deliver seeds. He came to see if the blood that ran through her veins could heal what it once helped destroy. And now, Clara had to decide what to do with that truth. She rode into town for the first time in weeks. The same town that had whispered behind her back when her fields failed. The same townsfolk who had offered sympathy with fake smiles while hoping she'd sell off the farm. Now they stared in shock as her wagon rolled by, loaded with golden pods, bright produce, and wild herbs no one could name. They asked questions. Clara gave no answers. Instead, she visited the land records office, quietly, firmly, and she added a clause to her family's deed. She didn't erase the past. She wrote over it. She designated 100 acres, the most fertile part of the land, to a community trust in Mikal's name. The trust would be managed by the nearest Navajo council. No sale, no fence, no expiration. The land would breathe again in its own language, not English. Some scoffed. Some warned her of legal trouble. She didn't flinch, because redemption wasn't paperwork. It was soil and memory. It was planting something good in the place where shame once grew. When she returned home, the wind had changed again. This time, it carried the scent of smoke, not destruction, but ceremony. She followed it to the ridge, where 3 Navajo elders stood near a small fire ring. One of them held a clay bowl filled with the powder made from crushed seeds and red earth. Without speaking, they scattered the powder in a slow circle. Then they turned and walked away. Clara stood alone, watching as the wind picked up the ashes, swirling them into the air like a message rising skyward. The land had not just forgiven, it had marked her that she was no longer just a Beaumont. She was a keeper of echoes. And the valley, once bitter, now held its breath for what would come next. Autumn arrived gently that year, the kind of season that didn't shout but whispered. The sun came later, left earlier. Morning fog curled around the fences like memory. Clara stood beneath the cottonwood every dawn now, bare feet in warm soil, listening not for voices, but for presence. The pods from the mystery plants had vanished, melted into the ground, as if they were never meant to be harvested, only planted. But their purpose lingered. The soil was richer, the crops stronger, and something in the air carried an ancient calm, as though the land itself had been heard for the first time in a century. The town had changed too, though slowly. Word spread about Clara's crops, how they grew when no one else's did, how she seemed to have summoned rain where there had been dust. Some called it luck, some called it witchcraft, but many simply called it earned. The market stalls now stocked produce from her farm. Healers came for her herbs. Storytellers came for her soil. No one whispered anymore. They watched with quiet respect, but Clara wasn't concerned with their opinions. She was still unraveling the legacy left beneath her father's boots and her grandfather's silence. One evening, just as the last leaves fell in golden waves across the ridge, Clara found a final letter. It wasn't hidden. It lay opally on her windowsill, as if the wind had placed it there. The parchment was thick, stitched around the edges with black horsehair. The handwriting she recognized instantly, her grandfather's. When the valley speaks your name, you will know your place in the circle. The stones remember. So must you. Beneath the letter was a map not of land, but of lineage. A hand-drawn tree with roots deep into names she'd never heard: Navajo, Spanish, French, Mescalero. All winding toward one name, Clara Micala Beaumont. Micaela. The name of the man from 1871. Clara's great-grandfather. The secret wasn't that the land had been stolen, it was that it had never been fully lost. Her blood carried both the taker and the keeper. And her name had never been Clara alone. She had inherited a bridge. She had become the echo of reconciliation. She stood once more at the cottonwood, where the wind no longer howled but hummed. The 13 stones still circled the roots, moss now creeping around their edges, as if time approved. Then she heard it, not in her ears, but in her bones. The valley said her name, not Clara, not Beaumont, but Micala. And the earth beneath her pulsed once, softly, as if to say, you are the redemption. She pressed her hands into the soil, not to plant, but to thank. And behind her, from the trail near the ridge, came the sound of hoofbeats. She turned, expecting no one, but there, beneath the setting sun, was the same black horse. No rider, just a silver ring she'd once been given, now tied around its neck. The horse waited, not to be claimed but to guide. Clara stepped forward, took the reins, and walked alongside it, not away from the valley, but deeper into it. Toward the canyons, toward the past, toward a future only. The land knew how to show, because frontier redemption wasn't a place, or even a story. It was a decision, and she had made hers. Sometimes the land speaks in silence. Sometimes redemption grows where shame once took root. And sometimes a broken valley waits generations for someone brave enough to listen. If this story moved you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. More stories from the edge of memory are coming soon, only on Echoes of Frontier Redemption.